There was a time when an empire ruled a third of the world, and almost no one saw its fall coming. Welcome back. I'm glad you're here. Settle in, get comfortable, and let the noise of the day drift away as we move slowly through history together. If there's a story, a place, or a moment in time you'd like to fall asleep to, let me know in the comments. I read them all, and I'll bring your ideas to life in future journeys. And before we begin, tell me where in the world you're listening from tonight. I always find it incredible how far these quiet stories travel. If you enjoy drifting off to these kinds of stories, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one. Now, let's step into the past. Before the Qing Dynasty ruled China, it existed as an idea forming in the forests, river valleys, and open hunting lands beyond the old Ming frontier. Its founders did not begin as masters of Beijing, nor as heirs to the Ming imperial city, but as leaders among the Jurchen peoples of Manchuria in the northeast. From that world of horsemen, hunters, kinship alliances, and shifting loyalties emerged one of the most powerful dynasties in Chinese history. The Qing would become the last imperial dynasty of China, but its beginnings were not Chinese in the narrow courtly sense. They were frontier beginnings. Hard, mobile, suspicious, disciplined, and ambitious. The dynasty itself was formally established in 1636 by the Manchus in Manchuria, though it became the ruling dynasty of all China in 1644, when the collapse of the Ming opened the gates of empire to them. At the center of that transformation stood Nurhaci. Born in 1559, he was a chieftain of the Jianzhou Jurchens, one among several rival Jurchen groupings living in Manchuria. The region was not isolated from the Chinese world. It was tied to it through trade, tribute, military pressure, and constant border negotiation. But it was not governed by Beijing in any deep sense. Power there had to be made by force, persuasion, and family strategy. Nurhaci proved brilliant at all three. He rose from relatively modest beginnings, gathered followers, broke rivals, and did what many frontier leaders attempt but few achieve. He turned a cluster of tribal relationships into a durable political military machine. His most important creation was not simply an army, but a whole social order organized for expansion. This became the banner system. In time, the Manchu rulers would use it as a military structure, an administrative framework, and a mark of identity. Men, households, and dependents were grouped into banners under colored flags. Later, as the Manchus conquered and absorbed neighboring peoples, Mongol banners were added in 1635 and Chinese banners in 1642, creating a broader imperial war machine. What made the banners so effective was that they were not merely battlefield units. They bound military service, social rank, economic support, and political loyalty together. A banner was a community under arms. In this way, conquest was woven directly into daily life. Nurhaci also turned grievance into legitimacy. He had once stood in a tributary relationship with the Ming, but relations hardened into hostility. In 1618, he launched an attack against Ming China, beginning a conflict that would outlast him but define his legacy. It was not yet the conquest of China proper. It was the opening of a long transition, the moment when a frontier polity ceased to be merely regional and declared larger intent. Nurhaci died in 1626, before seeing final victory. Yet by then he had already built the structure, identity, and momentum that made later conquest possible. He did not complete the Qing Empire. He made the kind of state that could. After Nurhaci's death, power passed to his son Abahai, better known to history as Hong Taiji. If Nurhaci was the founder in arms, Hong Taiji was the founder in statecraft. He understood that to conquer China, one could not remain merely a steppe or forest warlord. One had to look like a dynasty. One had to command not only fear, but ceremony, bureaucracy, and a language of rule that elites could recognize. Under Hong Taiji, the regime moved decisively in that direction. He adopted institutions based on the Ming model, including central administrative boards. He also widened the coalition around the throne, drawing in Mongol nobles and Chinese officials, not as temporary auxiliaries, but as parts of a growing imperial structure. In 1635, the United Jurchen people were officially renamed Manchu. The next year, in 1636, Hong Taiji proclaimed the Great Qing. The new name mattered. It announced that this regime was no longer merely the later Jin, a successor to an earlier Jurchen kingdom, but a universalizing dynasty with wider claims. That act was political theater, but not empty theater. It was backed by armies, institutions, and ambition. By the time the dynasty took the name Qing, it had already begun to think beyond Manchuria. It was preparing not simply to raid the Ming, but to replace it. Yet the Qing did not conquer a healthy empire. The Ming world they faced was exhausted. In the late Ming decades, fiscal strain, administrative decay, military weakness, and severe harvest failures all weakened the dynasty. Rebellions spread. Bandit armies became political forces. Among their leaders, Li Zicheng rose the farthest. In 1644, he marched into Beijing. The last Ming emperor, abandoned and desperate, killed himself. The old dynasty did not fall in a final grand clash between Ming and Manchu. It collapsed inward first. Only then did the Manchus arrive to seize the larger prize. At that decisive moment, another man entered the story. Wu Sangui, a Ming general stationed near the strategic Shanhai Pass, where the Great Wall met the northeastern route into China proper. Faced with Li Zicheng's rebel regime and unwilling to submit to it, Wu sought Manchu help. The Manchu leader directing events was Dorgon, uncle and regent for the young Shunji emperor. Wu's alliance with Dorgon changed Chinese history. The pass was opened. The combined forces struck Li Zicheng's army, defeated it, and advanced on Beijing. Dorgon entered the capital in June 1644. The Ming had fallen, but the Qing had not merely come to restore order on someone else's behalf. They came to found their own rule. The child placed on the throne was Fulin, remembered by his reign title as the Shunji Emperor. He was only a boy, and real power in the early years lay with Dorgon. Still, the symbolism mattered. The Qing were no longer outsiders pressing at the gates. They were now in the Forbidden City, occupying the throne of the Son of Heaven. But possessing Beijing was not the same as possessing China. Large parts of the country still lay beyond secure Qing control. Ming loyalist regimes survived in the south. Military strongmen held regional power. Rebel bands moved through unsettled provinces. The conquest of China had begun in 1644, but it was not finished there. It would take decades more. What followed was one of the most difficult tasks any conquering dynasty faces, not taking a capital, but turning conquest into government. The Manchus proved remarkably skilled at this. They did not dismantle the Ming state and start from nothing. Instead, they adopted much of the Ming governing structure and continued to employ Ming officials. This helped calm elite society and preserve administrative continuity. At the same time, they ensured that Manchu dominance would not dissolve inside the institutions they borrowed. High offices were often balanced so that Manchus held a large share of top authority. Military arrangements preserved a separate Manchu corps through the banner forces, while former Ming troops and local forces were organized into the Green Standard Army, which was deployed throughout the country to suppress disorder and guard the provinces. This dual method became a hallmark of early Qing rule. Adapt Chinese institutions, but do not surrender Manchu control. Speak the language of dynastic legitimacy, but keep conquest visible in the structure of power. It was a delicate balance. Too much separation, and the dynasty would remain foreign occupiers. Too much assimilation, and the conquerors might lose their identity and military edge. The early Qing managed this tension better than many expected. They learned to rule as emperors of China while preserving themselves as Manchus. That achievement would help explain the dynasty's longevity. Still, legitimacy was never simply declared. It had to be fought for. Resistance persisted for years, especially in the south. The Qing advance was slow, violent, and uneven. Cities changed hands. Loyalties shifted. Ming loyalism remained emotionally powerful among many officials, scholars, and local communities. Even after the court established itself in Beijing, the South could not be assumed. The early Shunji years were therefore not an age of settled rule, but a long civil and military struggle over who truly possessed the mandate of heaven. Only by 1659 were the last Ming remnants on the mainland driven out, leaving Taiwan as the main surviving refuge of Ming resistance. The Shunji emperor himself did not live long. He died in 1661, probably of smallpox, and his death revealed how fragile dynastic transitions could be. Yet even here the Qing showed calculation. His successor, the Kangxi emperor, was chosen in part because he had already survived a smallpox attack. That detail, small at first glance, opens a window into early modern politics. In a palace system where childhood mortality could reshape empires, disease was not private misfortune. It was a matter of state. Kangxi came to the throne as a boy, but unlike many child emperors, he would not vanish behind regents forever. He would become one of the greatest rulers in Qing history. Kangxi inherited a throne that was still not secure. The danger now came not only from lingering Ming loyalists, but from the enormous delegated power the Qing had granted to certain Chinese commanders during the conquest. 3 major warlords, rewarded for their role in subduing the south, held semi-autonomous domains with private armies. These became known as the 3 feudatories. Their arrangement had been useful in war, but it was intolerable in peace. A dynasty cannot be sovereign in name while great military clients govern vast territories like personal kingdoms. Sooner or later, Beijing had to choose between accommodation and confrontation. The decision came in 1673. When Kangxi offered to retire, the Kangxi emperor moved quickly to accept the surrender of such powers. The gesture forced the issue with the others, especially Wu Sangui, the same man whose opening of the pass in 1644 had helped bring the Manchus into China. Kangxi understood the risk. If the feudatories remained, they would remain a permanent threat. If he moved against them, he might provoke a major war. He chose war. Wu Sangui rebelled, beginning the revolt of the three feudatories. At first, the crisis was immense. Qing forces suffered reverses. The rebellion spread across southern and southwestern China. There were tremors beyond the immediate front as well, including unrest among Mongol groups. For a time, the dynasty's future was not assured. This was the true test of early Qing rule. Not the entrance into Beijing, but whether the dynasty could survive the fragmentation that often follows conquest. Kangxi's answer was persistence, strategic patience, and central resolve. He proved far more formidable than his age suggested. Qing authority held. Wu Sangui never succeeded in transforming rebellion into a new founding. He even styled himself emperor, but it came too late and meant too little. The rebellion dragged on until 1681, when Qing forces entered Kunming and ended the war. The dynasty had passed through fire and emerged far stronger. After 1681, no provincial military lord could easily imagine that he stood above the throne. One last major pocket of resistance remained beyond the mainland. On Taiwan, the Zheng family, descendants of the maritime power built by Zheng Chenggong, known in the West as Koxinga, continued to resist Qing rule. Zheng Chenggong had taken Taiwan from the Dutch in 1662 and made it a base of anti-Qing loyalism. For years, the Qing lacked the naval strength to destroy this regime outright. They tried instead to isolate it, even forcibly relocating coastal populations inland in an effort to cut support and trade. Only in 1683, after internal conflict weakened the Zheng position, did the Qing seize the opportunity. Their forces crossed the Taiwan Strait, the Zheng regime surrendered, and Taiwan was incorporated into Fujian province. With that, the long conquest that had begun from the Manchu frontier entered a new phase. The Qing were no longer merely conquerors fighting for possession. They were the undisputed dynasty of China. By 1683, what had started with Nurhaci's frontier consolidation had become an empire seated in Beijing, ruling through a combination of Manchu military structures and inherited Chinese administration, hardened by civil war and legitimized by survival. The banners had carried the dynasty into China, but it was adaptation, discipline, and ruthless political timing that kept it there. The early Qing had entered history as outsiders from the northeast. They ended their first generation as masters of the realm, no longer standing at the wall, but behind the dragon throne itself. The gates of empire did not open with ceremony. They opened in confusion, fear, and the echo of footsteps running through a city that no longer knew who ruled it. In the spring of 1644, Beijing was no longer the center of a stable world. It had become a prize waiting to be claimed, its authority already hollowed out from within before any foreign army truly seized it. The Ming Dynasty, which had ruled for nearly 3 centuries, did not end in a single dramatic clash between rival empires. It unraveled. It starved. It fractured under the weight of its own exhaustion. For years before the final collapse, the signs had been everywhere, though no one living within the system could fully grasp how close the end had become. Harvests failed in cycles that grew harder to recover from. Silver shortages disrupted the economy, making it difficult for the state to collect taxes in the form it demanded. Officials grew increasingly corrupt or ineffective, sometimes both at once. Along the northern borders, pressure from the rising Manchu power strained military resources. But it was not any single crisis that broke the dynasty. It was the accumulation, the slow grinding down of resilience, until even a strong structure begins to crack along invisible lines. Among the many rebellions that erupted during these final years, one rose higher than the rest. Li Zicheng was not born to power. He had once been a minor postal worker, a man who understood the empire not from the vantage point of court ritual, but from the dust of its roads. When rebellion came, he moved with it, shaping it, turning scattered unrest into something more organized, more dangerous. His forces gathered strength as Ming authority weakened, and by the early 1640s, he had become a figure that could no longer be dismissed as just another bandit leader. He was building something that resembled a rival state. As Li Zicheng advanced, towns and cities fell before him, sometimes through battle, sometimes through surrender, sometimes through simple abandonment. The Ming armies sent to stop him were often unpaid, poorly supplied, or unwilling to fight for a system that no longer protected them. By the time his forces approached Beijing, resistance had already begun to collapse. The capital itself, once the immovable heart of the empire, stood exposed. Inside the Forbidden City, the Chongzhen emperor faced the end in isolation. He had tried, in his own way, to reverse the decline of the dynasty. He dismissed corrupt officials, sought to restore discipline, attempted reforms. But he was working against forces too large, too deeply rooted, too far advanced. As Li Zicheng's troops entered Beijing in April 1644, there was no final army to defend the throne, no miraculous reversal waiting in the wings. The emperor fled to a hill behind the palace, a quiet place overlooking the city that was no longer his. There, he ended his life, hanging himself with a cord. The last Ming emperor died not in battle, but in solitude, marking the quiet, irreversible end of an era. Li Zicheng entered the capital not as a destroyer, but as a claimant. He declared the founding of a new dynasty, presenting himself as the man who had overthrown a corrupt regime and restored justice. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that he might succeed, that the mandate of heaven had passed not to the Manchus beyond the wall, but to this rebel who had risen from within. But power seized in collapse is not the same as power secured through structure. Li Zicheng had taken Beijing, but he had not yet built the kind of system that could hold it. Beyond the Great Wall, the Manchus watched closely. They had not caused the Ming collapse, but they understood its meaning immediately. The greatest obstacle to their expansion had just fallen, not by their hand, but by internal rebellion. What remained was opportunity, but also uncertainty. To move too quickly without preparation could be dangerous. To wait too long might allow another power to consolidate control. At the center of this moment stood Dorgan, the Manchu prince who effectively guided Qing's strategy. The rightful emperor, the Shunji emperor, was still a child. Real decisions rested in the hands of those who could interpret events and act decisively. Dorgan was one of those men. He saw clearly that the fall of Beijing did not mean the rise of a stable new order. It meant that China was open. Between the Manchus and Beijing stood a single critical barrier: Shanhai Pass. It was here that the Great Wall met the sea, forming one of the most important defensive positions in northern China. Whoever controlled that pass controlled access between Manchuria and the heartland of the former Ming Empire. And at that pass stood Wu Sangui. Wu Sangui was a Ming general, a man who had spent his career defending the dynasty that had now effectively ceased to exist. He found himself in an impossible position. Behind him, Beijing had fallen to Li Zicheng. Before him, the Manchu forces waited. To resist both would likely mean destruction. To choose one side would shape the future of the empire. Wu chose the Manchus. It was not a simple betrayal, though history would often frame it that way. It was a calculation born of urgency and distrust. Li Zicheng's regime did not inspire confidence among many former Ming elites. There were reports of disorder, of unstable governance, of a movement that had grown too quickly to establish legitimacy. The Manchus, by contrast, had structure, discipline, and a clear leadership hierarchy. Wu Sangui opened the gates of Shanhai Pass and aligned himself with Dorgan. What followed was swift. The combined forces of Wu Sangui and the Manchus moved against Li Zicheng's army. The confrontation was decisive. Li's forces, though numerous, lacked the cohesion and experience needed to withstand the assault. They were defeated, and Li Zicheng was forced to abandon Beijing almost as quickly as he had taken it. His brief claim to the throne dissolved into retreat, and within a short time, he would be dead, his rebellion collapsing into fragments. In June 1644, Dorgan entered Beijing. There was no longer any ambiguity. The Manchus were not coming as allies restoring the Ming. They were establishing their own rule. The young Shunji emperor was installed as the ruler of China, seated in the same forbidden city that had housed Ming emperors for generations. The symbolism was unmistakable. The mandate of heaven had shifted again. But symbols alone could not secure a dynasty. The Qing now faced the true challenge, turning a military breakthrough into lasting control over a vast, complex, and still deeply unstable empire. Beijing was theirs, but China was not yet. Across the country, Ming loyalists refused to accept the new order. In the south, alternative Ming regimes began to form, each claiming to continue the fallen dynasty. These were not coordinated movements, but they shared a common purpose: resistance. The Qing response was not hesitant. It was forceful, often brutal, and driven by the understanding that hesitation would invite fragmentation. One of the most controversial and symbolic policies introduced during this period was the Q order. Han Chinese men were required to shave the front of their heads and wear the remaining hair in a long braid, following Manchu custom. The order was simple in form but immense in meaning. It was a visible sign of submission. To refuse it was to declare opposition. Resistance to the Q order was widespread and often violent. In many cities, people chose death over compliance. The Qing enforced the policy with severity, making it clear that symbolic unity was not optional. The phrase that spread during this time captured the stark choice: keep your hair and lose your head, or cut your hair and keep your head. It was not merely about appearance, it was about authority. As Qing forces moved southward, they encountered both organized resistance and local defiance. Some regions surrendered quickly, calculating that survival mattered more than loyalty to a fallen dynasty. Others resisted fiercely. The conquest became a series of campaigns marked by shifting alliances, sieges, and, at times, devastating reprisals. Cities that resisted could face destruction, meant not only to punish, but to deter others. Yet even in the midst of violence, the Qing continued to build. They retained much of the Ming administrative structure, employing former Ming officials to govern provinces, collect taxes, and maintain order. This was not an act of generosity, but of practicality. The Manchus were too few to rule China alone. They needed the machinery of governance already in place, even as they ensured that ultimate authority remained in their hands. Gradually, the balance began to shift. Resistance did not disappear, but it weakened. The southern Ming regimes fell one by one, unable to coordinate effectively or sustain prolonged opposition. The Qing advance, though not without setbacks, continued steadily. Each victory was not just a military gain, but a step toward legitimacy. By the time the 1650s drew toward their end, the shape of the new dynasty had become clearer. The Qing were no longer temporary occupiers. They were rulers adapting to their new role, learning how to govern a civilization far larger and more complex than the world from which they had come. But beneath the surface, tension remained. The memory of the Ming had not faded. Loyalty, resentment, adaptation, and survival all coexisted in uneasy balance. The Qing had taken the throne, but they had not yet fully secured the hearts of the people they now ruled. And so the story did not settle. It moved forward into deeper conflict, into new challenges, into the long and often violent process of turning conquest into empire. Once Beijing had been taken and the young Shunji emperor had been placed upon the throne, the Qing possessed the image of rule before they possessed its reality. From the northern capital, proclamations could be issued, seals could be stamped, rituals could be performed, and the language of dynastic legitimacy could be spoken with confidence. But outside the walls of the capital, much of China remained unsettled, unconquered, or only loosely attached to this new order. The empire that the Manchus claimed in 1644 was still, in large part, an empire that had to be fought for village by village, river by river, province by province. The seizure of Beijing was dramatic, but it was only the beginning. The real conquest of China was slower, harsher, and far more uncertain than the moment of entry into the Forbidden City suggested. For many in the north, the fall of the Ming had come too suddenly to comprehend. For many in the south, it had not yet truly happened at all. The Ming court had collapsed in Beijing, but dynastic loyalty was not extinguished with the death of one emperor. Across the lower Yangtze, in the wealthy and densely populated heartlands of the south, there remained officials, soldiers, scholars, landlords, and local elites who could not accept that the mandate of heaven had passed to foreign conquerors from beyond the wall. Some clung to principle, some to habit, some to self-interest, and many to a mixture of all three. What mattered was that resistance persisted, and not merely in scattered local forms. New Ming courts began to emerge in succession, carrying forward the symbols of the fallen house and refusing to concede that the dynasty was truly dead. This southern resistance was both stronger and weaker than it appeared. stronger because it drew upon real loyalty, deep regional wealth, and the moral prestige of a dynasty that had ruled for nearly 3 centuries. Weaker because it was divided by geography, faction, court rivalry, and personal mistrust. Men who agreed that the Qing were illegitimate often disagreed sharply on who should lead the resistance, what strategy should be followed, and which region mattered most. The tragedy of the southern Ming lay partly in this. It had cause without unity, courage without coordination, legitimacy without sufficient power. The first of these courts formed quickly in Nanjing, the old southern capital of the Ming, where the Prince of Fu was enthroned as the Hongguang Emperor. Nanjing carried history in its stones. It had once been the capital of the dynasty, and its selection seemed at first both practical and symbolic, a gesture that continuity could still be preserved even after the fall of Beijing. But the court that assembled there was plagued from the outset by weakness. It inherited the forms of government, but not the discipline that might have made them effective. Rival factions maneuvered, decisions drifted. Some still seem to believe that the Qing might be negotiated with, contained, or delayed without the need for a full reckoning. That illusion did not last. The Qing, from their side, understood that speed mattered. If the South were allowed time to consolidate under a credible Ming restoration, the conquest could become a prolonged partition, perhaps even a permanent one. So they moved. Their armies advanced along key corridors, and in 1645, they captured Nanjing. The Hongguang regime collapsed with startling speed, a sign not that southern resistance had no strength, but that its leadership had never turned that strength into a coherent defense. For those who had hoped the South might become the secure refuge of the Ming House, the fall of Nanjing was a devastating blow. Yet the resistance did not end there. It moved further south and further inward, assuming new forms around new pretenders and surviving princes. There would be the Longwu Emperor in Fujian, the Xiaowu Emperor, and later the Yongli Emperor in the far southwest, each representing another attempt to continue Ming legitimacy in exile. The very number of these courts revealed both endurance and fragility. Each surviving branch of the imperial family offered a banner around which loyalists might gather, but each also divided loyalty, duplicated administration, and diluted already scarce resources. There was no single center of resistance, no one place where the full moral and military force of Ming loyalism could be concentrated. The Qing conquest of the lower Yangtze and the southeast was marked not only by campaigns and sieges, but by extraordinary violence. This was not an accidental feature of the conquest. It was part of the political logic by which the new dynasty sought to make resistance appear hopeless. In cities that resisted stubbornly, the punishment could be terrifying. Yangzhou became the most notorious example. In 1645, after fierce resistance under the Ming loyalist defender Shi Kefa, the city fell to Qing forces under the Prince Regent Dodo. What followed entered memory as a massacre so severe that it became emblematic of the conquest itself. Whether later numbers were exaggerated or not, the horror was real enough. Yangzhou was remembered not merely as a battlefield defeat, but as a warning written in blood. Not long afterward, Jiading also suffered repeated massacres after resisting the Qing and the enforcement of the Q order. The violence was both military and symbolic. The Qing were sending a message to all who still imagined that local courage and city walls might preserve the old world. Resist, and your city may be broken beyond repair. Submit, and life, though transformed, may continue. This was empire-making in one of its starkest forms. The Qing did not conquer China by military skill alone. They also conquered it by making selective terror part of the arithmetic of survival. The Q order sharpened this conflict everywhere it went. To the Manchus, the hairstyle was a marker of loyalty and a practical way of distinguishing subject from rebel. To many Han Chinese, it was an intolerable humiliation, a visible inscription of conquest on the body itself. Hair, in Confucian moral thought, was not trivial. It had been received from one's parents and was not lightly altered. To shave the forehead and wear the queue was therefore to submit not just politically, but culturally and symbolically. In many places, the order provoked rebellion precisely because it reduced a vast constitutional question to a personal daily ritual. It forced every man into a visible relationship with the new state. This is one reason the conquest was so intimate. Dynasties can rise and fall far above the lives of ordinary people, noticed mainly through taxes, banners, and the changing faces of magistrates. But the early Qing entered homes, streets, and marketplaces through the enforcement of appearance, speech, and gesture. The question was no longer merely who sat in Beijing. It became whether one would wear submission on one's own head. The resulting resistance was as emotional as it was political, and the Qing repression of it was correspondingly severe. Still, terror alone could not build a lasting dynasty. The Manchus understood this. Their military core was formidable, but they were a minority ruling an enormous sedentary population with sophisticated administrative traditions. They could not govern China as if it were only conquered territory. They needed continuity. They needed taxes to be collected, granaries supervised, roads maintained, legal cases heard, and the educated elite persuaded or compelled to serve. So even as they punished resistance, they preserved much of the Ming administrative framework. Chinese officials were recruited back into office. The civil bureaucracy remained indispensable. The examination system, though disrupted by war, would continue and later become one of the chief mechanisms through which Qing legitimacy deepened. This combination of severity and continuity gave the conquest its peculiar character. The Qing were foreign conquerors, unmistakably so, and they did not conceal their military dominance. But they also presented themselves as restorers of order after the collapse of Ming rule and the disorder of rebellion. In place after place, this claim found an audience. Not everyone submitted out of fear alone. Some submitted because the wars had become unbearable, because famine and banditry had already devastated their region, because the Ming cause seemed hopelessly divided, or because stable government, even under alien rulers, seemed preferable to endless uncertainty. There were also military realities that favored the Qing. Their forces, especially the banner armies, were disciplined and mobile, and they benefited from the support of Chinese defectors who brought knowledge, personnel, and logistical reach. The Green Standard Army, composed largely of former Ming troops and other Chinese forces, became increasingly important in occupation and counterinsurgency. This was crucial. The Qing conquest was not accomplished by Manchus alone. It depended heavily on Chinese collaborators, surrendered commanders, and local intermediaries who decided, for reasons ranging from conviction to necessity, that their futures would be better served under the new dynasty than in futile loyalty to the old. As the years passed, the surviving Ming courts were pushed farther toward the edges of the empire. In the southeast, the sea became both refuge and problem. Maritime power, which the Ming state had often viewed uneasily, now became one of the last tools of loyalist resistance. None embodied this more than Zheng Chenggong, better known in Western accounts as Kangxi. He was a figure almost made for legend, the son of a powerful maritime merchant and pirate with Japanese maternal ancestry, a Ming loyalist commander of exceptional determination, and one of the last great opponents of Qing consolidation. Kangxi's power rested not on court ceremonial, but on ships, coastal networks, armed followers, and control of maritime trade routes. He posed a different kind of challenge from the inland southern Ming courts. He could move, strike, withdraw, and survive in a zone where Qing power was weakest. In 1661, he launched his famous campaign against the Dutch on Taiwan, and in 1662 he drove them out, creating a new base for anti-Qing resistance. Taiwan, once peripheral in the imagination of many Chinese statesmen, now acquired new strategic significance. It became a redoubt of Ming loyalism and a reminder that conquest of the mainland did not mean total pacification. Meanwhile, in the southwest, the Yongle Emperor remained a wandering symbol of Ming continuity. His court moved through Guangxi, Guizhou, Yunnan, and eventually toward the Burmese frontier, sustained by loyalists who refused to surrender despite the shrinking horizon of their cause. There was something almost ghostly about this last Ming court, moving farther from the centers of civilization, carrying with it a fading imperial dignity into mountain corridors and tropical borderlands. It was no longer a realistic alternative government for all China, but it remained a moral challenge to Qing claims. As long as a Ming emperor lived, however diminished, the dynastic transfer remained incomplete in the eyes of many. The Qing were relentless in pursuing these remnants. By 1659, their forces had overrun the last substantial southern Ming positions on the mainland. The Yongle Emperor fled into Burma, where distance briefly preserved him, but distance was no lasting defense. In 1662, after Qing pressure, the Burmese handed him over, and he was executed. With his death, the mainland hope of Ming restoration effectively ended. The dynasty that had once ruled from Beijing and Nanjing now survived only in memory, in local acts of mourning, and in the maritime resistance centered on Taiwan. Even so, the Qing conquest cannot be understood only as a sequence of military victories. It was also a psychological transformation. Over time, people adjusted. Families who had once spoken the Ming name with reverence began to speak of the Qing as the government under which their children would live. Officials who had hesitated entered service. Scholars who had withdrawn in grief or protest confronted the slow pressure of reality. Not all reconciled themselves inwardly, but more and more learned to live outwardly within the new order. This is how conquest becomes durable. Not when every enemy is annihilated, but when enough of the conquered cease to imagine that history can be reversed. And yet the violence left scars that did not disappear. Local memory preserved them, Loyalist writings preserved them. Stories of fallen cities, butchered populations, and ruined households lingered beneath the later grandeur of Qing rule. The dynasty that would go on to preside over one of the greatest periods of imperial power in Chinese history had been forged in civil war and conquest so severe that some regions never forgot its opening face. This mattered because legitimacy built by order can coexist for generations with memory built by grief. By the early 1660s, the Qing stood in a new position. They had not completed every task. Taiwan remained outside their grasp under Zheng family control. Certain frontiers were still unstable. The integration of the empire was far from complete. But the central fact had changed. The Qing were no longer merely invaders advancing from the northeast. They were the rulers of China, seated in Beijing, obeyed across most of the provinces, and increasingly able to shift from conquest to consolidation. The age of taking had not ended, but another age was beginning beside it. The age of governing what had been won. And governing would prove, in its own way, as difficult as war. When the great violence of conquest began to recede, what remained was something quieter, but no less dangerous. The question of whether the Qing could truly rule what they had taken. Victory in war had given them cities, provinces, and submission, but it had not yet given them stability. Beneath the surface, the empire was still unsettled, its loyalties uncertain, its wounds fresh, and its structure incomplete. The banners that had carried the Manchus to power could not by themselves sustain that power across generations. The dynasty needed something more enduring than momentum. It needed control, not just over territory, but over the men who governed it. The Shunji emperor had died young, leaving the throne to his son, who would become known to history as the Kangxi emperor. He was only a child when he ascended in 1661, chosen in part because he had survived smallpox, a disease that could quietly determine the fate of dynasties. In his early years, real authority did not rest with him, but with regents appointed to govern in his name. Among them, one figure rose above the others in ambition and dominance: Oboy. Oboy was not merely a caretaker of power. He was a man who intended to shape it. As a senior Manchu noble and experienced military leader, he had the credentials to command respect, but he also possessed the will to bend the court to his own advantage. Under his influence, policy hardened. The regency became less a collective guardianship and more an instrument of personal authority. Decisions that should have reflected the balance of the dynasty instead began to reflect the will of one man. For the young Kangxi emperor, this created a dangerous environment. He was not yet in control, but he was not unaware. He watched. He learned. He understood that if the dynasty was to survive beyond its first generation, it could not be governed indefinitely by regents who treated imperial authority as something to be managed rather than embodied. The emperor had to become real. In 1669, at the age of 15, Kangxi made his move. It was not a reckless act, but a calculated one. With the support of loyal allies within the court, he orchestrated the arrest of Oboy. The moment was decisive. The young emperor stepped out from behind the shadow of regency and asserted his personal rule. It was a quiet coup, but its implications were immense. From that point forward, The Qing state would no longer be guided by caretakers. It would be directed by an emperor who intended to rule. Kangxi's early reign was marked by caution, but not hesitation. He understood that authority, once seized, had to be exercised with consistency. He did not attempt to remake the system overnight. Instead, he worked within it, strengthening its functions, reinforcing its hierarchies, and ensuring that loyalty flowed upward toward the throne rather than outward toward regional power bases. This was not the work of a moment, but of years, and it would soon be tested in a way that few emperors ever faced. The greatest threat to Qing's stability did not come from external enemies, but from within the structure the dynasty itself had helped create. During the conquest of southern China, the Qing had relied on powerful Chinese generals to secure vast territories. In return for their service, these men had been granted significant autonomy, including control over provincial administrations and large standing armies. At the time, this arrangement had been practical. It allowed the Qing to extend their reach quickly without overstretching their own forces. But once the conquest ended, what had been an advantage became a liability. 3 of these commanders stood above the rest. Wu Sangui in Yunnan and Guizhou, Kangxi in Guangdong, and Geng Jingzhong in Fujian held domains that functioned almost like independent kingdoms. They collected taxes, maintained armies, and exercised authority that rivaled the central government. They were, in effect, rulers within the empire, bound to the Qing throne by loyalty that was as much personal as it was political. For a time, this arrangement persisted. The Qing tolerated it because they had no immediate alternative. But Kangxi understood what it meant. A dynasty cannot endure if its power is divided among regional warlords who command their own resources and answer only loosely to the center. Sooner or later, such a system either fractures or collapses. The moment of decision came in 1673. Kangxi, aging and perhaps sensing the changing winds, requested permission to retire and return to his homeland. Kangxi granted the request, and with it, he signaled something larger. He intended to dismantle the power of the feudatories. It was a calculated risk. By accepting Shang's retirement and moving to absorb his territory back under direct imperial control, Kangxi forced the other 2 feudatories to confront their own future. Wu Sangui, the most powerful among them, did not wait passively. He had been instrumental in the Qing rise to power, opening the gates at Shanhai Pass nearly 3 decades earlier. But time had changed the nature of his position. He was no longer a general serving a cause. He was a ruler defending a domain. When it became clear that the Qing intended to strip him of that domain, he chose rebellion. The revolt of the 3 feudatories began. It spread with alarming speed. Wu Sangui declared himself the leader of a new movement, invoking the restoration of Chinese rule against what he framed as foreign domination. Geng Jingzhong joined the rebellion. Kangxi's son, Shang Jiqin, would later be drawn into it as well. What had begun as a policy decision in Beijing became a civil war that engulfed much of southern China. For the Qing, the situation was perilous. The rebellion controlled large territories, commanded experienced armies, and drew upon deep local resources. In the early stages, imperial forces suffered setbacks. Supply lines stretched thin. Communication faltered. The possibility of a divided empire, or even a complete collapse of Qing authority, became real. Kangxi, still a relatively young ruler, faced the defining crisis of his reign. It would have been easy to retreat, to compromise, to allow the feudatories to retain their power in exchange for temporary peace. But Kangxi understood that such a compromise would only postpone the problem. A dynasty that could not enforce its authority would eventually lose it. So he chose to fight. The war that followed was long and exhausting. It did not resolve in a single decisive battle, but through a series of campaigns, advances, retreats, and shifting strategies. The Qing adapted. They reorganized their forces, improved coordination, and relied increasingly on the Green Standard Army, whose soldiers were familiar with the terrain and conditions of the south. Over time, the balance began to shift. Wu Sangui, for all his experience, could not transform rebellion into legitimacy. In 1678, he declared himself emperor of a new dynasty. The act was bold, but it came too late. It did not unify the resistance. It did not inspire widespread support. Instead, it revealed the limits of his position. He was a powerful warlord, but he was not the center of a new political order. That same year, Wu Sangui died. His death weakened the rebellion at a critical moment. Leadership passed to his grandson, but the momentum had already begun to falter. Qing forces pressed their advantage, reclaiming territory, isolating rebel strongholds, and tightening their control. By 1681, the revolt was over. The last resistance was crushed in Yunnan. The feudatories were no more. The significance of this victory cannot be overstated. It was not merely the suppression of a rebellion. It was the elimination of a structural threat to Qing rule. From that point forward, no regional commander would possess the same level of autonomy. The empire would be governed from the center, not negotiated among competing powers. Kangxi emerged from the conflict transformed. He was no longer the young emperor who had seized power from a regent. He was now the ruler who had preserved the dynasty in its most dangerous moment. His authority was no longer theoretical. It was proven. But even as the internal threat was resolved, another challenge remained beyond the mainland. Taiwan, under the control of the Zheng family, continued to exist as a base of resistance. It was a reminder that the conquest of China, though largely complete, was not absolute. The Qing had, until this point, struggled to project power across the sea. Their strength lay on land. But the existence of an independent regime so close to the coast was unacceptable. It offered refuge to loyalists, disrupted trade, and stood as a symbol that Qing rule was not yet universal. In 1683, after years of preparation and the weakening of Zheng leadership through internal divisions, the Qing launched a decisive campaign. Their forces crossed the Taiwan Strait and confronted the Zheng navy. The battle was hard fought, but the outcome was clear. The Zheng regime collapsed. Taiwan surrendered. With that, the last major stronghold of organized resistance to Qing rule was gone. The empire was, at last, unified. Kangxi did not treat this moment as an endpoint, but as a beginning. The wars of conquest and consolidation had defined the first decades of Qing rule. What lay ahead would define its character. Stability had been achieved, but it had to be maintained. Authority had been secured, but it had to be exercised wisely. The Qing Dynasty, born in the forests of Manchuria, forged in the violence of conquest, and tested in the fires of rebellion, now stood as the undisputed ruler of China. But the challenges of ruling an empire of such scale and complexity were only just beginning. After the rebellion of the three feudatories had been broken and Taiwan had submitted, the Qing Dynasty entered a different kind of age. The great question of survival, which had hung over the first decades of Manchu rule, no longer pressed with the same immediate force. The dynasty had proven that it could conquer China, hold China, and defeat those within its own political structure who imagined themselves too powerful to obey. For the first time since entering Beijing, the Qing court could breathe in something like confidence. Not peace in the simple sense, because an empire is never entirely peaceful, but confidence that the throne in the Forbidden City was not a temporary occupation. It belonged now to a dynasty that intended to endure. This change altered the atmosphere of rule. Kangxi was no longer merely reacting to crisis. He was beginning to shape an imperial order. It is one thing to inherit a state under siege and prevent it from collapsing. It is another to govern a vast empire in such a way that both elites and common people begin to think of the dynasty not as foreign conquerors, but as the natural center of political life. This was the deeper work of the High Qing, and much of it began under Kangxi. He understood something that many rulers do not. Military success creates space, but it does not by itself generate legitimacy. A dynasty must be seen, heard, and felt in ways that go beyond force. It must appear just. It must appear competent. It must appear morally serious. And above all, in the Chinese imperial tradition, it must appear to be in harmony with the responsibilities of the Son of Heaven. Kangxi worked carefully to inhabit that role. He cultivated not only power, but presence. He studied. He read widely. He took statecraft seriously as an intellectual discipline, not merely as an inheritance. Confucian political thought, which had long defined the ethical vocabulary of governance in China, could not simply be discarded by the Qing. The Manchus had conquered the empire, but they now ruled a civilization whose educated elites judged legitimacy through texts, precedents, rituals, and moral expectations. Kangxi recognized that brute command would never be enough. He needed the scholar official class, not only to administer the empire, but to accept him as an emperor in the proper civilizational sense. So the Qing court continued to restore and reinforce the examination system, the great mechanism by which educated men entered official service. This mattered enormously. The examinations did more than select bureaucrats. They reconnected the dynasty to the rhythms of literati life. They told the educated classes that there was still a path forward within the state, that learning still had purpose, that ambition could once again be tied to imperial service rather than withdrawal or mourning. Over time, this helped reduce the sense that Qing rule was merely a military overlay on Chinese society. Instead, the dynasty began to root itself in the habits of governance that scholars and officials recognized as proper. Kangxi also moved carefully in the realm of ritual and symbolism. He paid close attention to ceremony, precedent, and imperial performance. The emperor in China was never simply an administrator. He was the axis between heaven and earth in political imagination, the supreme ritual figure whose conduct had cosmic implications. Droughts, floods, rebellions, harvest failures, eclipses, and strange signs in nature could all be interpreted as reflections on imperial virtue. Kangxi embraced the burden of that role with unusual seriousness. He issued edicts in a tone that often projected concern for the people, anxiety over official misconduct, and moral responsibility for disorder. This was not empty language. It was part of the machinery of legitimacy, and in a society deeply attuned to moralized politics, it mattered. One of the ways Kangxi made himself visible as a ruler was through his imperial tours, especially his journeys to the south. These tours were not vacations. They were political theater of the highest order, but theater with administrative function. By traveling, inspecting river works, meeting local officials, observing conditions, and performing imperial concern in person, Kangxi extended his presence beyond the palace. The South, with its wealth, commerce, scholarship, and lingering memory of Ming legitimacy, required careful attention. A northern conqueror seated only in Beijing might remain distant, abstract, and suspect. An emperor who physically entered the southern landscape, who showed interest in its people and infrastructure, could begin to soften that distance. These southern tours were particularly connected to one of the most important practical questions of the age: water control. The empire depended on grain, transport, taxation, and internal stability, all of which were tied in complex ways to rivers and canals. The Yellow River was notoriously unpredictable, capable of shifting course and causing devastation on a massive scale. The Grand Canal remained essential for transporting grain from the fertile south to the political center in the north. A ruler who neglected hydraulic management did so at enormous peril. Kangxi took these matters seriously, supporting efforts to maintain dikes, regulate waterways, and preserve the transport network on which the fiscal and political life of the empire depended. Here, the logic of imperial government becomes clear. A dynasty survives not only through ideology or arms, but through grain moving where it must move, taxes arriving where they must arrive, and peasants being spared enough catastrophe that they do not become rebels. The grandeur of the High Qing rested on countless practical foundations. When fields were flooded, when silt choked canals, when corruption consumed local relief efforts, the consequences rose upward toward the throne. Kangxi's active concern with infrastructure and administration helped strengthen the perception that Qing rule brought order rather than only conquest. At the same time, the empire was expanding in imagination as well as in territory. The Qing were not simply becoming another Chinese dynasty in a narrow sense. They were developing into a multi-ethnic imperial formation with a broader horizon. The Manchu rulers understood that they stood at the intersection of several worlds: the Chinese agrarian and bureaucratic world, the inner Asian world of steppe diplomacy and military alliance, the Mongol world, and the Tibetan Buddhist world. This gave Qing power a distinctive shape. Kangxi did not govern as though all subjects were to be managed identically. Instead, the court adapted its language and methods depending on the region and people involved. This flexibility was especially important in relation to the Mongols. The Qing had inherited both opportunity and danger on the steppe. Mongol groups had long been central to the balance of power in Inner Asia. Some had allied with the Manchus during the rise of the dynasty, and those bonds remained important. But the steppe was never politically static. and the greatest threat came from the Zhonghars, a powerful Oirat Mongol confederation in the northwest. Their rise posed a strategic challenge to Qing security and imperial ambition. If the Zhonghars could dominate Inner Asia, they might threaten Qing influence among the Mongols and destabilize the frontier. Kangxi was therefore compelled to look beyond the heartland of China. His reign saw major campaigns against the Zhonghars, including the long struggle with Galdan. These were not simple border skirmishes. They were contests over the shape of empire itself. For the Qing court, victory in the northwest was necessary to prevent hostile power from coalescing in Inner Asia. It was also necessary to maintain credibility among Mongol allies, who would judge Qing's strength by their ability to protect and dominate the larger steppe order. The campaigns were difficult, and the terrain itself imposed enormous burdens. Distance stretched supply lines. Climate punished armies. Information moved slowly, but Kangxi showed persistence and strategic patience. The Qing ultimately weakened Galdan's position and reasserted imperial authority in the region. These campaigns revealed that the dynasty's future would not be confined to China proper. The Qing were becoming something larger, an empire whose northern and western frontiers would matter as much as the settled agricultural core. This broader imperial structure was also reflected in the way the Qing preserved Manchu identity. Even as Kangxi embraced Confucian rulership and governed through Chinese institutions, he did not dissolve the distinctiveness of the ruling people. The banner system remained central. Manchu language, customs, and military traditions retained prestige at court. This balancing act was one of the dynasty's greatest achievements. The Qing had to become Chinese enough to rule China effectively, but not so fully absorbed that the conquerors lost their coherence as a ruling elite. The maintenance of banner identity, separate legal arrangements in certain contexts, and court attention to Manchu values all helped preserve that distinction. Yet this success carried within it a quiet tension. The more effectively the Qing governed as Chinese emperors, the more their Manchu difference became, for many subjects, less visible in daily life. And the less visible it became, the more effort the court sometimes needed to preserve it intentionally. This was not yet a crisis under Kangxi, but it was already a structural issue. A conquest dynasty that rules well must constantly decide how much to assimilate and how much to remain apart. Meanwhile, ordinary life across much of the empire began to settle into more predictable rhythms. War-torn regions recovered, population grew, fields were restored, markets revived. Local society, which had been shaken by decades of warfare and upheaval, began to reorganize itself around the new imperial center. This was not an age without suffering. Floods still came. Famine still threatened. Taxes still burdened. Officials still abused power. But compared with the dislocation of the late Ming collapse and the conquest era, the later decades of Kangxi's reign increasingly appeared as an age of restoration. The fiscal position of the dynasty also benefited from this stabilization. The Qing inherited tax structures from the Ming, but they governed with a degree of caution shaped by the memory of dynastic collapse. Kangxi in particular was attentive to the danger of overburdening the people. He became associated with tax remissions and a style of paternal rulership that presented frugality and restraint as virtues of government. Whether every local reality matched the ideal is another matter, but the image was powerful. A ruler who avoided reckless extraction could more plausibly claim moral authority. There was also a cultural dimension to this period of consolidation. The Qing court increasingly became a patron of scholarship, compilation, and literary activity. This too was political. To patronize culture was to claim stewardship over civilization. It was a way of saying that the dynasty did not merely command armies. It preserved, organized, and transmitted the intellectual inheritance of the realm. This process would reach even greater heights later, but its foundations were visible already under Kangxi. Foreign contact added another layer to the age. Jesuit missionaries at court, valued in part for their expertise in astronomy, mathematics, and technical knowledge, occupied a curious place in this world. Kangxi showed interest in certain forms of Western learning, particularly where they served imperial purposes. The court's engagement with Jesuits did not mean openness in any modern liberal sense, but it did reveal the emperor's curiosity and pragmatism. Knowledge from abroad could be used, provided it fit within imperial priorities. The Qing at this stage did not yet feel threatened by Europe in the way they later would. They encountered it from a position of confidence, and confidence perhaps best captures the mood of this era. The High Qing Golden Age did not appear overnight as a finished thing. It emerged gradually through recovery, centralization, competence, imperial performance, and expansion. Under Kangxi, the Qing state developed the habits of durability. It learned how to bind frontier and heartland, how to present a foreign-born dynasty as guardian of Confucian order, how to discipline provincial power, and how to make peace feel like proof of heaven's favor. Still, no golden age is ever as seamless as later memory suggests. Beneath recovery lay population pressures that would grow more serious in time. Beneath administrative order lay corruption that could never be fully eradicated. Beneath imperial confidence lay the enormous complexity of ruling a vast and varied empire. But for now, these were not yet dominant shadows. The light of the age was stronger. The dynasty seemed young in strength, broad in possibility, and increasingly secure in the belief that it had not only taken China, but inherited the right to shape its future. And at the center of that world stood Kangxi, no longer the boy emperor who had inherited a precarious throne, but the ruler under whom the Qing began to look less like conquerors, surviving the aftermath of war, and more like the natural masters of a flourishing empire. When the Qianlong emperor came to the throne in 1735, he inherited something rare in the history of dynasties, not merely a crown, but a system already working. His grandfather Kangxi had secured the empire through endurance, war, and careful moral performance. His father Yongzheng, though ruling only briefly, had sharpened the machinery of administration and strengthened the fiscal core of the state. By the time Qianlong assumed power, the Qing dynasty stood on a foundation of order, revenue, confidence, and prestige. He did not need to rescue the empire. He needed to inhabit its greatness, and for many decades, he did exactly that. His reign lasted until 1796, though he retained influence until his death in 1799, and it came to be remembered as the high crest of Qing power. The moment when the empire appeared widest, richest, most self-assured, and most complete. It is easy, looking back, to imagine this peak as a static image, as though the empire simply stood there in perfect balance beneath a confident ruler. But the Qianlong age was not stillness. It was motion disguised as stability. Armies marched into distant lands. Scholars labored over enormous compilations. Court painters, poets, officials, and craftsmen worked under imperial patronage. Caravans crossed frontiers. Population continued to rise. Wealth circulated through markets and river systems. The emperor himself moved through the empire in tours, ceremonies, and campaigns, performing mastery over a realm so vast that no single human being could ever truly hold it all in his hands. The greatness of the age came partly from this illusion made believable, that one court in Beijing could stand at the center of a world stretching from the rice fields of the southeast to the deserts and mountain corridors of Inner Asia. Under Qianlong, that illusion became, for a time, almost real. He was the fourth Qing emperor, and unlike the founders of the dynasty, he was born into imperial security. He did not rise from frontier struggle. He grew up amid palace discipline, ritual expectation, and the accumulated confidence of a house that had already proved itself. This matters because rulers formed in security often mistake inheritance for permanence. Qianlong did not make that mistake at first. He was energetic, cultivated, and deeply conscious of image. He wished not merely to rule, but to be seen as the fully realized Confucian monarch, the universal sovereign, the patron of civilization, the victorious lord of a multi-ethnic empire. These ambitions were not empty vanity. They became the organizing principles of his reign. He understood that the Qing Dynasty could not survive on military memory alone. It had to present itself as the grand steward of all under heaven. Much of that presentation rested on expansion. Under Qianlong, Qing territory reached its greatest extent, encompassing Mongolia, Tibet, Taiwan, and major portions of Central Asia. The imperial court celebrated this through what later became known as the 10 Great Victories, a series of military campaigns that the emperor promoted as proof of martial brilliance and heaven's favor. Some of these victories were cleaner in imperial memory than they were in reality. Campaigns were expensive, difficult, and often brutal, but taken together, they transformed the empire's shape and ambition. The Qing were no longer simply rulers of China proper who happened to possess frontier zones. They became a continental empire in a fuller sense, ruling across ecological, linguistic, religious, and cultural worlds that could not be reduced to a single model of governance. The most consequential of these campaigns unfolded in the northwest against the Dzungars. The Dzungar Confederation represented the last great Inner Asian rival capable of contesting Qing dominance on a large scale. This was not merely a border inconvenience. It was a strategic and civilizational challenge. As long as a powerful steppe polity could organize in the northwest, Qing authority over Mongolia and access to Central Asia remained uncertain. The struggle against the Dzungars therefore became central to Qianlong's imperial project. In the campaigns of the 1750s, Qing forces moved decisively, defeating Dzungar resistance and extending imperial control into Xinjiang. The result was immense. The northwest frontier was redrawn, the empire's continental mass expanded, and Qing rule reached a territorial high point that later generations would remember as the fullest map of dynastic power. To rule such spaces required more than conquest. The Qing court had long understood this, and Qianlong continued the tradition of differentiated rule. In China proper, the dynasty spoke the language of Confucian order, civil bureaucracy, and classical legitimacy. In Tibetan Buddhist regions, it presented itself in ways suited to religious and political expectations there. Among Mongol elites, the emperor appeared not simply as a Chinese monarch, but as a steppe ruler within a familiar imperial grammar. This flexibility was one of the dynasty's great strengths. It allowed the Qing to govern a realm that was not culturally uniform without demanding uniformity everywhere. The empire at its peak was therefore not simply Chinese enlarged. It was layered, adaptive, and multilingual in its political imagination. That complexity was a source of power, but also of strain, because such a system required exceptional administrative confidence and continuous attention from the center. While armies expanded the empire's horizons, the court deepened its claim to cultural supremacy. Qianlong was a prolific patron of the arts and letters. He wrote poetry obsessively, collected paintings, inscriptions, bronzes, jades, and antiquities, and positioned himself as the supreme arbiter of taste and tradition. To later eyes, some of this can look overbearing, even vain. His own inscriptions were sometimes stamped across masterpieces from earlier ages with an imperial self-assurance that feels almost intrusive. But in his own world, this was part of sovereignty. To collect civilization was to govern it. To annotate the past was to claim custody over it. Court culture under Qianlong was not decoration around power. It was power in cultivated form. This impulse found one of its grandest expressions in the compilation of the Siku Quanshu, the complete library of the four treasuries. The project was monumental, gathering and classifying a vast body of Chinese literature and scholarship. It remains one of the great editorial enterprises in imperial history. Yet, like many imperial achievements, it had a double face. The same project that preserved texts also became entangled with censorship, especially where works were judged hostile to Manchu rule or politically suspect. Qianlong's court celebrated itself as the guardian of civilization, but guardianship included deciding what aspects of that civilization were permitted to endure unchallenged. Preservation and suppression moved together. The dynasty enshrined the literary past, while also pruning it, reminding scholars that culture flourished by imperial favor and under imperial scrutiny. The Qianlong age thus carried an interesting tension. It was genuinely brilliant in its cultural ambition, and yet that brilliance was inseparable from control. The emperor admired scholarship, but he expected loyalty from scholars. He loved the past, but he insisted on possessing it. He presided over a court of refinement, but refinement did not imply softness. Literary inquisition and censorship reminded the educated elite that elegance and fear could coexist. A poem, a phrase in a private manuscript, a line interpreted as anti-Manchu, could have consequences far beyond the page. The dynasty that patronized civilization also disciplined memory. At its peak, it could afford to do both. To those living under its peace, the age could nevertheless seem astonishingly prosperous. Population growth was dramatic across the Qing period, and by the broader span of the dynasty, it would rise from roughly 150 million to about 450 million. Much of that increase gathered momentum in the 18th century, supported by agricultural expansion, relative order, and integration of markets. New crops and intensified cultivation helped sustain the growth, while internal trade tied regions together more tightly than before. In many places, ordinary life likely felt more stable than it had under the late Ming collapse or the conquest era. Markets revived, land was worked more intensively, families multiplied, a sense of imperial abundance settled over the landscape. But abundance has shadows, and Qianlong's age generated them even while appearing triumphant. Population growth, which later writers often treat as evidence of prosperity, was also a silent pressure building beneath the empire's surface. Land did not expand as quickly as people. Holdings became smaller. Marginal soils were cultivated. Vulnerability increased for those living near subsistence. What looked from the capital like flourishing demographics could feel, in the countryside, like tightening margins and fiercer competition for survival. The High Qing was rich enough to conceal this for a time, but not rich enough to abolish the problem. That would matter later, when shocks came and local resilience proved thinner than imperial confidence had assumed. The emperor himself embodied both the splendor and the danger of the age. He was diligent for many years, but he was also seduced by his own success. Long reigns often create a special distortion around rulers. If crises are mastered repeatedly, if courtiers praise without interruption, if the empire appears to answer every campaign with victory and every project with grandeur, then the line between confidence and complacency begins to blur. Qianlong remained formidable, but the later decades of his reign grew heavier. The state still looked magnificent. Its weaknesses became harder to perceive precisely because its prestige remained so high. One of the clearest signs of this deepening vulnerability was the rise of Haitian, the notoriously powerful favorite of Qianlong's later years. His name became synonymous with corruption. Under the aging emperor, he accumulated wealth and influence on an extraordinary scale, distorting the court and weakening administrative integrity. Corruption had never been absent from imperial government, but in the later Qianlong period, it acquired a more corrosive symbolic force. If the emperor at the center of the greatest empire on earth could be so thoroughly served by a man so widely associated with venality, what did that say about the condition of the system beneath the polished surface? The answer would only become fully visible after Qianlong's death, when Hessian was rapidly brought down. But by then the damage had already helped reveal a state whose magnificence had begun to cover rot. Even military triumphs contained warning signs. The campaigns of the 10 Great Victories consumed enormous sums. They enhanced imperial glory and expanded territory. But they also strained resources. Distance, logistics, and occupation created ongoing costs that victory monuments did not always mention. The farther an empire extends, the more expensive it becomes to persuade itself that extension is permanent. Garrisons must be supplied, roads maintained, officials monitored, local populations managed. The Qianlong court could bear these burdens for a time because it had inherited strong finances and a capable bureaucracy. Yet the very success of the age encouraged the belief that the treasury was deep enough for endless display, endless campaigning, endless assertion of grandeur. That too was an illusion. though one not fully shattered until the next reign. Meanwhile, beyond China's shores, another kind of encounter hinted at futures the Qing court did not yet fully understand. European trade remained restricted largely to Guangzhou under what later came to be known as the Canton system. From the Qing point of view, this arrangement made sense. Foreign merchants could be managed, supervised, and contained at one port, preserving hierarchy and limiting disruption. The empire did not view itself as needing foreign access in any profound sense. It was vast, self-confident, and accustomed to understanding external relations through a tributary and imperial framework rather than through modern notions of equal sovereign states. That framework had worked tolerably well for a long time. Under Qianlong, it still appeared natural. The Macartney Embassy of 1793 would later stand as a famous symbol of this collision of assumptions. Lord Macartney arrived seeking expanded trade rights and a diplomatic relationship that Britain conceived in terms of negotiation between states. The Qing court, by contrast, treated the mission through its own imperial logic, regarding the gifts as tribute and the encounter as one more demonstration of China's superior centrality. The embassy failed to secure the commercial changes Britain wanted. At the time, from the Qing perspective, this could seem perfectly reasonable, even inevitable. Why should a universal empire revise its habits to satisfy an island kingdom at the edge of the world? Yet in retrospect, the moment appears ominous. It revealed a widening gap between the Qing understanding of the world and the emerging international order gathering force beyond Asia. Qianlong saw no need to bend. History would later show how costly that confidence could become. Still, it would be unfair to turn the Qianlong reign into nothing more than a prelude to decline. For most of its span, it was one of the most formidable periods of imperial rule anywhere in the early modern world. The empire was territorially immense, culturally ambitious, administratively sophisticated, and capable of projecting authority across extraordinary distances. Court ritual, military power, artistic patronage, and bureaucratic governance all seemed to reinforce one another. To subjects within the empire and observers beyond it, Qing power could appear almost inexhaustible. That appearance was itself historically significant. Great empires do not influence the world only through what they materially possess. They also shape reality through what others believe they possess. Under Qianlong, the Qing mastered the performance of completeness. And yet completeness is impossible for any human system. The later years of the emperor's life make that painfully clear. He abdicated formally in 1796 so as not to reign longer than his grandfather Kangxi, whom he revered, but he continued to wield real power until his death in 1799. It was a final act characteristic of his reign, ceremonially modest on the surface, but carefully staged to preserve prestige. Beneath that prestige, however, the empire was no longer as balanced as it had seemed. Corruption had spread. Military expenditures had taken their toll. Population pressure was intensifying. Administrative effectiveness was less dependable than before. Even rebellion would soon return in more troubling ways, as seen in the White Lotus uprising that began during the closing years of his reign and exposed bureaucratic weakness and widespread corruption. The age of summit had already begun to lean toward dissent. That is the strange sadness of imperial peaks. They are most dazzling at the very moment when they become hardest to sustain. The Qianlong Emperor stood amid treasures, maps, victories, libraries, poems, banners, envoys, and ceremonies, and from that center, the empire seemed whole. But greatness can hide fatigue. Splendor can conceal overreach. A ruler can spend decades believing he has perfected the order he inherited, only to leave behind a machine that still shines while its gears begin silently to wear down. The Qing under Qianlong reached the height of its territorial and cultural power. It also, in those same years, accumulated many of the pressures that would later test whether such greatness had substance enough to survive a harsher century. When the Qianlong Emperor died in 1799, the empire he left behind still appeared immense, ordered, and deeply rooted. From the vantage point of the capital, little seemed broken. The frontiers stretched far into Central Asia. The bureaucracy still functioned. Grain still moved along the canals. The emperor's image, carefully cultivated over decades, lingered as a memory of strength. Yet something had shifted, quietly but decisively. The Qing Dynasty had not fallen into sudden crisis. It had entered a slower, more subtle transformation, one that would take time to reveal itself fully. The surface remained calm, but beneath it, pressures were gathering in ways that the old structures of governance were not prepared to manage. The new emperor, known as the Qing Emperor, inherited both the grandeur and the strain of his predecessor's long reign. One of his first acts was to confront what had become impossible to ignore: the overwhelming influence and corruption of Heshen. Almost immediately after Qianlong's death, Heshen was arrested, stripped of power, and ordered to take his own life. His vast fortune, accumulated through years of unchecked authority, was confiscated. The act was dramatic and necessary. It signaled that the new emperor intended to restore discipline and correct the excesses of the previous era. But it also revealed something deeper. A system that had allowed such corruption to flourish at the very center of power could not be repaired simply by removing one man. The problems ran wider. Population had continued to grow rapidly, building on the expansion of the 18th century. Villages that had once supported modest communities now strained under increasing numbers. Land was divided and subdivided. Fields worked more intensively, margins for survival narrowing. For many families, life became more precarious even as the empire as a whole appeared prosperous. This was one of the great contradictions of the late Qing world. On paper, the dynasty governed a vast and productive realm. In reality, millions lived closer to the edge than before, dependent on fragile balances between harvest, tax, and survival. The administrative system, which had functioned effectively under strong emperors like Kangxi and Yongjing, began to show signs of fatigue. Corruption did not vanish with Heshen's fall. It remained embedded in local governance, in tax collection, in the distribution of relief, in the quiet transactions that linked officials and communities. Magistrates were often overburdened, responsible for vast populations with limited resources. Communication between center and periphery remained slow. Reports could be shaped, softened, or delayed as they moved upward. The emperor might issue edicts calling for honesty, restraint, and efficiency, but the distance between intention and implementation widened as the system grew more strained. One of the clearest signs that something was changing came not from the court, but from the countryside. The White Lotus Rebellion, which had begun in the later years of Qianlong's reign, continued into the early years of Jia Qing's rule. It was not a single unified uprising, but a series of interconnected movements rooted in religious sectarianism, local grievance, and social pressure. The White Lotus teachings blended elements of Buddhism and folk belief, offering promises of salvation and renewal in a world that many felt had become unstable and unjust. The rebellion spread across regions of central China, drawing in peasants, displaced people, and those who found themselves without secure livelihoods. It was not simply an ideological movement, it was also a symptom. Where governance weakened, where economic pressure intensified, where local elites failed to maintain order, movements like this could grow. Suppressing them required more than military force. It required addressing the conditions that allowed them to take root. But the Qing response, as it had been in earlier crises, leaned heavily on suppression. The campaigns against the White Lotus rebels dragged on for years. They were costly, difficult, and often ineffective in the short term. Rebel groups would disperse, hide, and reappear. Terrain favored them. Local support networks, whether voluntary or coerced, sustained them. The Qing military, particularly the Green Standard Forces, struggled to maintain consistent pressure. Banner troops, once the cutting edge of Qing power, were less effective in these kinds of dispersed conflicts. Over time, the dynasty did suppress the rebellion, but the cost was revealing. It exposed weaknesses in coordination, discipline, and financial management. It showed that the empire was no longer as quick or as confident in dealing with internal unrest. At the same time, the fiscal strain of prolonged campaigns and administrative inefficiency began to accumulate. The treasury, once robust, was no longer as secure. Military expenditures rose. Corruption siphoned off resources. Relief efforts during times of flood or famine were sometimes insufficient or mismanaged. The balance that had sustained the High Qing between revenue, expenditure, and stability was becoming harder to maintain. There was also a more subtle transformation taking place in the relationship between the state and society. During the earlier Qing period, strong emperors had projected a sense of paternal authority. The ruler was imagined as a moral center, responsible for the well-being of the people, attentive to their suffering, capable of correcting abuses. Under Kangxi and Yongzheng, this image had been reinforced through action. Under Qianlong, it had been amplified through display. But in the early 19th century, that connection began to weaken. The emperor remained distant. Edicts still spoke of care and responsibility. But for many ordinary people, the experience of government was increasingly shaped by local conditions, by the behavior of officials on the ground, by the realities of tax, labor, and survival. When those realities became harsh, the image of the benevolent ruler could feel abstract, even hollow. Meanwhile, beyond the borders of the empire, a different kind of change was unfolding, one that the Qing court did not yet fully grasp. In Europe, industrialization was beginning to transform economies, technologies, and patterns of power. Trade networks were expanding. Naval capabilities were improving. The relationship between states was evolving toward a system that emphasized negotiation, competition, and, when necessary, force in new ways. These developments were distant from Beijing, but they were not irrelevant. The Qing worldview remained shaped by older assumptions. The empire saw itself as the central civilization, surrounded by lesser states that could be managed through tribute, ritual, and controlled exchange. Foreign merchants were permitted to trade under strict conditions, primarily through the port of Guangzhou. This system, which had functioned adequately for decades, was based on the belief that the Qing did not need the outside world in any fundamental way. But the outside world was beginning to need China differently. European demand for Chinese goods, tea, silk, porcelain, was growing. Trade imbalances emerged. Silver flowed into China, but tensions developed over how exchange should be conducted. Foreign merchants, particularly from Britain, sought greater access, fewer restrictions, and more predictable terms. The Qing court, confident in its own position, saw little reason to accommodate these demands. To them, foreign trade was a privilege granted, not a right to be negotiated. This difference in perspective did not immediately lead to conflict, but it laid the groundwork for future confrontation. The Qing believed they were managing trade within a stable framework. European powers increasingly viewed that framework as restrictive and unjust. Inside the empire, most people remained unaware of these distant tensions. Their concerns were closer to home: land, taxes, harvests, family survival. Yet even here, the pressures of change could be felt. Population growth meant that younger sons might not inherit enough land to sustain themselves. Migration increased as people moved in search of opportunity or simply to escape hardship. Social networks shifted. In some areas, secret societies and local militias became more prominent, filling gaps left by weakening administrative control. The Qing state was not collapsing. It still commanded vast resources. It still maintained order across most of its territory. But it was no longer as responsive, as efficient, or as confident as it had been at its peak. Problems that might once have been resolved quickly now lingered. Solutions that had worked before seemed less effective. The sense of effortless authority that had characterized the High Qing began to fade. Qing himself was not an incapable ruler. He recognized many of the challenges facing the dynasty. He attempted reforms, sought to reduce corruption, and worked to restore fiscal stability. But he faced a system that had grown more complex and less flexible. The tools available to him were not always sufficient for the problems at hand. The momentum of decline is often not dramatic. It is gradual, built from small inefficiencies, repeated compromises, and the slow erosion of confidence. By the time his reign progressed, the pattern had become clearer. The Qing dynasty was entering a new phase, not yet one of open crisis, but one in which the balance between stability and strain was shifting. The empire still stood, but it no longer stood effortlessly. The memory of the High Qing remained powerful. It shaped expectations. It influenced how officials thought about governance, how the court understood its own role, how the dynasty imagined its place in the world. But memory can be a burden as much as a guide. When rulers believe they are continuing a golden age, they may fail to see that the conditions that made that age possible have already begun to change. The Qing, at the beginning of the 19th century, was still one of the largest and most powerful empires in the world. But its strength was no longer expanding. It was being tested, and the tests that lay ahead would not resemble the ones it had already passed. The first great collision between the Qing Dynasty and the industrial West did not begin with cannon fire. It began in habit, appetite, and imbalance. For centuries, China had exported goods that the world desired deeply and in growing quantities. Tea, silk, and porcelain moved outward in vast streams, carrying with them not only wealth, but prestige. To many in Europe, Chinese goods represented refinement itself. Tea in particular became indispensable in Britain, woven into daily life so completely that demand seemed almost bottomless. Yet the Qing court, secure in its own self-understanding, had little interest in importing much from Europe in return. Foreign merchants wanted Chinese products, but China did not want enough European goods to balance the trade. The result was a drain of silver from Britain into China, and to British officials and merchants, this was not merely inconvenient, it was intolerable. The old Canton system, through which foreign trade was tightly regulated and confined largely to Guangzhou, had been designed from the Qing point of view to preserve order and hierarchy. It treated foreign merchants as manageable outsiders, not equal representatives of sovereign powers entitled to negotiate on reciprocal terms. Trade was permitted, but under restrictions, supervised by licensed Chinese merchants, with limited access, narrow seasonal rhythms, and little room for foreign political ambition. For a long time, the Qing court believed this arrangement was sufficient. It assumed that because China was central and self-sustaining, the outer world would continue to approach it on terms China dictated. But the world beyond the empire was changing faster than the court understood. Britain, transformed by commercial expansion and industrialization, no longer approached foreign trade as a minor supplement to imperial order. It pursued markets aggressively. It expected influence to follow commerce. It possessed a navy unlike anything the Qing had ever been forced to reckon with. Yet even Britain could not immediately solve the basic problem of trade imbalance. Its merchants needed something they could sell into China at scale. Over time, that something became opium. Opium had a long history in Asia, but the 19th century trade transformed its role in China. Produced largely in British India and smuggled into Chinese ports despite legal prohibitions, opium spread with devastating speed. At first, the problem may have seemed containable, another illicit trade in a vast empire accustomed to evasion and corruption at its margins. But opium was not a marginal commodity. Demand rose. Addiction spread. Silver, which had once flowed into China through trade, now began to flow out to pay for the drug. What had been a commercial problem for Britain became a social, economic, and moral crisis for the Qing state. By the early 19th century, officials could no longer pretend the matter was limited or local. Opium use extended through many layers of society. Soldiers, clerks, merchants, laborers, and even officials were touched by it. The drug weakened households, strained finances, and eroded discipline. Just as troubling for the state, it exposed the incapacity of law when law was not backed by honest enforcement. Smuggling networks thrived because officials could be bribed, local interests could profit, and coastal control was far from absolute. The Qing state still possessed authority on paper, but the opium trade revealed how easily that authority could be hollowed out by corruption and compromise. The Daoguang emperor, who came to the throne in 1820, inherited this growing crisis. He was not blind to it. He understood that opium was damaging the empire, morally and materially. He also understood that the state could not indefinitely tolerate a trade that drained silver, fostered vice, and made the law appear ridiculous. Yet deciding to act and acting effectively were not the same thing. Within the court, there was debate. Some argued for legalization and taxation, reasoning that the trade could not be stopped and might better be managed openly. Others insisted on strict prohibition and forceful suppression. At stake was not just policy, but the dignity of the state. To legalize opium might seem practical. It might also seem like surrender. In the end, prohibition won. The man chosen to enforce it was Lin Zexu, one of the most respected officials of his age. He was serious, disciplined, and morally committed. Precisely the sort of official the dynasty needed if it hoped to confront a crisis that was as much ethical as economic. In 1839, Lin was sent to Guangzhou with broad authority to suppress the opium trade. He approached the task with energy and conviction. Foreign merchants were pressured to surrender their opium stocks. Chinese dealers and users faced intensified penalties. The line between tolerated smuggling and imperial prohibition was redrawn in unmistakable terms. Lin Zexu's actions culminated in the seizure and destruction of large quantities of opium at Human. The event was dramatic and symbolic. It declared that the Qing state still possessed the will to defend itself against poison and lawlessness. From the court's perspective, this was an act of justified sovereignty. A government was destroying an illegal and harmful substance within its own territory. But from the British perspective, matters looked different. The opium surrendered had commercial value. Its confiscation was treated as an injury to British property and prestige. Behind the legal language stood a harder truth. Britain had the naval and military means to force the issue, and it was increasingly willing to use them. The First Opium War began in 1839. If the Qing had understood the scale of the transformation taking place in global military power, they might still have resisted, but they would not have done so under so many illusions. The war exposed those illusions mercilessly. Qing forces were not without courage, but courage could not compensate for technological inferiority, weak coordination, poor training, and strategic confusion. British warships moved with terrifying effectiveness along the coast and rivers, striking where they pleased, bypassing defenses, and demonstrating that the old assumptions of distance and imperial containment no longer held. The sea, once a margin from which danger occasionally emerged, had become a highway of power that the Qing could not control. The contrast was not only in weaponry, though that mattered enormously. It was also in institutions, doctrine, and tempo. British forces operated within a military system shaped by industrial production, global naval logistics, and a state increasingly practiced in projecting force abroad. The Qing, by contrast, had built their empire through cavalry, banner mobilization, frontier management, and inland administrative strength. They had not been compelled to modernize against industrial maritime powers because no such challenge had yet forced itself upon them. Now one had arrived, and the empire was unprepared. Defeat came not as one single catastrophic collapse, but as a sequence of humiliations. British forces captured strategic positions, moved northward, and demonstrated repeatedly that Qing resistance was disjointed and inadequate. The court in Beijing struggled to respond effectively. Information from the front was often incomplete or distorted. Local commanders exaggerated successes or concealed failures. The emperor, distant from the battlefield and reliant on memorials filtered through bureaucratic channels, could not always see clearly what was happening until events had already outrun policy. In 1842, the war ended with the Treaty of Nanjing. This treaty marked a turning point not only in Qing history, but in the history of China's relationship to the wider world. The Qing were compelled to pay a large indemnity, cede Hong Kong to Britain, and open several treaty ports to foreign trade. The old Canton system was broken. The treaty did not resolve the opium issue in any morally satisfying way, nor did it establish an equal diplomatic order in any modern sense. What it did establish was precedent. A Western power had defeated the Qing militarily and extracted terms by force. The empire that had long imagined itself the center of civilization had been compelled to negotiate from weakness. The psychological impact of this cannot be overstated. Dynasties survive military defeats. They can recover from lost campaigns, invasions, and even occupations. But what the Opium War shattered was something broader. The confidence that the Qing world order was sufficient to interpret and manage every serious external challenge. The empire had encountered an opponent who did not fit the old categories, who could not be absorbed into tributary logic, who did not seek admission into the existing hierarchy, but wished to reorder the terms entirely. And yet, even after the treaty, the court did not fully grasp the scale of the transformation underway. Many officials treated the conflict as an aberration, a coastal disturbance to be managed, rather than a sign that the world itself had changed. Some believed that if the foreigners were handled carefully, if trade were supervised and tensions reduced, equilibrium could still be restored. But the new treaty port world had its own momentum. More foreign merchants arrived. Missionaries gained greater access. Consuls demanded rights and protections. Extraterritoriality, formalized in later treaties, meant that foreigners would increasingly stand outside the ordinary reach of Qing law. In port cities, enclaves of foreign power emerged physically and legally within the empire's territory. The sovereignty of the Qing state had not vanished, but it had been punctured. Meanwhile, opium did not disappear. The war fought in the name of enforcing law against the drug had ended by weakening the very state that sought to control it. Smuggling continued. Consumption continued. The contradiction was cruel. China had tried to defend itself from a corrosive trade and had instead been punished for insisting on that defense. For many within the empire, this deepened the sense that the age had become morally inverted, that force rather than justice now governed the relationship between civilizations. The years after the First War did not bring recovery so much as uneasy adaptation. The treaty ports became new zones of exchange and tension. Foreign commercial influence expanded. Chinese merchants and intermediaries learned to navigate the new conditions, sometimes profitably. Coastal societies changed. New knowledge, new goods, new religious actors and new pressures entered the empire through openings that had been forced from without. Yet the Qing center remained politically conservative, still shaped by institutions and assumptions developed for a different world. This gap between external change and internal response widened over time. By the 1850s, tensions between the Qing and the Western powers had again intensified. Britain and France sought further concessions, broader access, and more secure diplomatic footing. The Qing, weakened by internal unrest and still reluctant to normalize foreign demands on equal terms, resisted. The result was the Second Opium War, beginning in 1856. If the First War had been a shock, the second was a deeper humiliation because it came after the Qing already knew what foreign force could do and still could not prevent it. The campaigns of the late 1850s and 1860 were brutal and revealing. Anglo-French forces advanced toward Beijing itself. Qing resistance once again proved inadequate. In 1860, after negotiations collapsed and foreign prisoners were abused and killed, British and French troops looted and burned the Imperial Summer Palace complex, the Ming Yuan. The destruction was not merely military retaliation. It was symbolic devastation, an assault on imperial grandeur, memory, and prestige. To burn the emperor's gardens, libraries, and treasures was to announce that even the aesthetic heart of Qing majesty was vulnerable to foreign arms. The Convention of Beijing that followed imposed further concessions. More ports were opened. Foreign envoys were allowed to reside in the capital. Indemnities increased. Kowloon was ceded to Britain. The legal and diplomatic space of foreign power in China expanded further. The Qing court, which had once imagined the outer world approaching in tribute, now had to endure resident foreign representatives in its own capital. The inversion was complete. And still, perhaps the most devastating aspect of these wars was not the immediate loss of territory or money, though those were significant. It was the cumulative erosion of authority. The people of the empire could see that the court could not repel foreign invasion. Officials could see that the administrative and military systems inherited from the High Qing were no longer sufficient. Local elites could see that in times of emergency, they might need to organize defense and relief themselves. Each of these recognitions weakened the central state in subtle ways. A dynasty rests not only on coercion, but on belief. The Opium Wars damaged belief. There is a tragedy in how slowly this was understood. The Qing were not stupid. They were not uniquely blind or decadent in some simple moral sense. They were a vast agrarian empire shaped by older political logics, facing industrial powers whose methods and assumptions had developed along very different lines. The collision was therefore not merely between one good government and one bad one, or one modern civilization and one backward state. It was a confrontation between systems formed in different historical worlds. But history is not gentle with systems that fail to adapt quickly enough. It measures consequence, not intention. As the dynasty staggered through this era of humiliation, another danger was already rising from within, one that would prove even more destructive than foreign war. The Qing state, weakened by external pressure and internal strain, now faced a rebellion on a scale so vast that it would shake the empire to its core.